Dr. Duke joined with Sandy Stotsky for part 3 of our conversation about what the state of education is. We're on the cusp of a big election, a lot's at stake in terms of who takes over the Department of Education. Please visit the first two iterations of our conversation if you want that background. But we're going to talk today about an ongoing issue here related to that, and it's how do we, Sandy, get stronger teachers? I can tell you right from the outset, I teach at elementary school, I teach middle school and high school teachers, kids who want to be teachers in college. And they'll tell me the same thing. They tell me that their education department isn't teaching them skills, it's not teaching them subjects, it's not concerned very much about making them better at teaching math or science or history. What they're getting almost without challenge in their education part of their education is straight up ideology, straight up political indoctrination stuff. How do we get stronger teachers, number one? And how do we get them if the education departments have decided that ideology actually trumps knowledge?
I'm not sure I can answer the last part of your set of comments, but I can say that the people who are being trained to be the future teachers in this country are going to have to speak up themselves about what they're capable of teaching students, children, depending upon the grade level. Younger students, they're teaching them how to read and write and do arithmetic, basic arithmetic. As they get up into the high school level, there is a subject that has to be taught. And do they feel confident about the subject they are teaching? I don't know. From these younger people now in schools of education, which raises the question of why they aren't taking right now a strong undergraduate major in the subject they want to teach. That's a big issue. How do we get good high school teachers or middle school high school teachers if they're not studying those subjects in depth?
I know over the course of your long career, Sandy, you must have seen from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, you must have seen the increasing influx of ideological perspectives that downplay knowledge for knowledge's sake. How did we used to handle those? How did we, when you were still teaching, how did you, and when you were advising Massachusetts on how to get some of the best standards and best teachers in the country, how did you kind of fight off that trend in education? What were your arguments or what was your plan?
We began with strong standards. That was always helpful. And my goal was always to say, what do we need in a teacher if this is what we expect them to be teaching? It is well known that you can't teach what you don't know. This was a common adage everywhere. So they had to learn something. Ideology was not going to be anything that gave them a background in a subject-oriented curriculum. We didn't want a teacher-oriented curriculum or a student-oriented curriculum. We wanted a subject-oriented curriculum. For elementary teachers, we actually had to get to the point where we specified the kind of coursework we expected elementary teachers to have, because we were going to give them subject matter tests. That may be one of the clues. If you have a number of people in an area developing a subject matter test, the teachers have to be prepared to take that test.
Now, I was really privileged to have you come out we helped get you out to Wisconsin here to help us fight the Common Core. I have given speeches alongside you at various Common Core events where you really hammered on the standards. I would talk about the sort of social issues surrounding the standards. And it does seem to me that a lot of what we were concerned about has come true, that the Common Core classroom was going to be ultimately much more about social engineering, social emotional welfare curriculum. It's going to be more about introducing topics like transgenderism and radical sexuality to kids. Those things all have come to pass. Those things that we said were going to happen happened. And Common Core, of course, as you have made a second career of pointing out to us, was ultimately going to fail as a set of standards. So here we are now with post-Common Core education, where the federal government is more involved than ever before, where textbook companies are colluding more than ever before to produce certain kinds of materials at the expense of others, and where you've got now social issues like Black Lives Matter and transgenderism dominating what goes on often in our public schools. What advice what can we do to try to turn that back? You said we have to appeal to young teachers. It would also mean we'd have to appeal to parents too, I would think too, about demanding more from their educational institutions.
Right. And it may be the case that we would have to have a return, for example, to the weekly quiz, which the teacher prepared based on what the teacher knew the teacher had taught. If you're teaching ideology, it's going to show up. And that's where the parent can come and see what the child has been taught. This is typical as a problem in the middle and high school grades in particular. It may not be as easy to detect in the lower grades when the actual curriculum is not that subject oriented, but by the time you get to middle school or junior high school, as we had that institution until about World War II, that was what it was called, and it started about 1900, but that's the teacher-made test is part of the key to this, because tests dominate, unfortunately, as we know today, the curriculum. And if teachers can go back to those short quizzes, they didn't have to be long, but they had to be made by the teacher because only the teacher knew what the teacher had taught. And I made it a point to see what the history teachers were teaching in my high school at one point when a group of us parents were really concerned about what was happening. And I saw what was happening in the history curriculum when teachers had to add essay questions of their own. It was clear that they were not teaching history, they were teaching something else. So they had to clean up their act. Our own very highly paid teachers at that time in the high school. And that's one avenue for parents to this day that they can take. But there are things that a State Department of Education, or whatever it's called, can do to make sure that ideology is not the most important thing that is done or taught at any grade level. And that is to get a group of teachers together and ask them to come up with what they think are standards. They're bound to come up with something that's going to relate to content. What else could they circulate around as a group of teachers in math? They'd have to come up with mathematics or science. I mean, they're going to be stuck if they have an ideology, because not everybody has the same ideology in mind.
Well, looking at the younger generations of teachers who are getting only an ideological education, they rally around the one thing they do have. The one thing my young teachers of English have in common is they don't know much English, but they know a lot about multiculturalism. They know a lot about defeating the patriarchy. They know a lot about white supremacy and white privilege. They're all up on that jargon, but you ask them to read a complicated text, they can't do it. In fact, I would argue that the one thing that unites the modern education major is not subject matter. It's it's all that superseding stuff there. So let me go back and ask you this. Let's say that because I like what you said, let's assume that we had some modicum of sanity in our public schools. From the ground up, in a couple of minutes, just give me a quick sense. From the ground up, how would you construct the system to make sure that we had the best teachers? You said it would start with really good standards. And what would those standards emphasize? And then from those standards, how do you move forward?
All right, the standards would be particularly applicable in the early grades. I don't know that you would need to have those standards for the middle grades or, say, junior high school, but you could get a group of teachers together, say in English, and ask them what reading or what authors would you want students to be familiar with and why. and let's see what they come up with. They have to have some reason for whatever they're doing. What is the order in which they would teach anything? What is their reason? They're going to fight with each other. If they fight with each other, someone else has to take over. That's part of the game that the person in charge of this mess, cleaning up the curriculum, has to be aware of, that the group of teachers they're dealing with, no matter where they have been trained and how ideologically they have been trained, is still going to have a problem specifying what they want their students to know and in what order. They don't understand sequence, possibly, because it hasn't been taught. But I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, because we need to have somebody in charge of the project that wants to know, well, what is the reason for this, that, or the other? Why? What is the why? And how many students have learned the why? What is meant by these terms? I mean, I wouldn't even understand multiculturalism. I had to cope with it, certainly back in the 60s when it started to be introduced into the English curriculum. But how difficult was the rest of the vocabulary? How many syllables? There are little tricks that anyone who is aware of what is going on in the school can use to pull out from any group of teachers what it is. What is their purpose? Let's talk about a purpose for whatever they're teaching. What is the purpose? And how would you know that the students had achieved that purpose? What would you do to assure parents that they had achieved the purpose? You'd have to have some clear examples to use, because you can't keep talking abstractly and expect to make sense of all of this.
I mean, you make a great point about how, again, it comes back to a lot of this depends on the teachers, where they are, what they're committed to, what their training is. Why is it that it seems like the modern teacher, who's been burdened with all sorts of non-teaching responsibilities like never before in our history, why is the modern teacher so unwilling to recognize their collective power and actually fight for better standards, better accountability for students? I mean, we saw the Red for Ed program, right? Where you had teachers walking out of, in certain states, walking out of class in unison to get higher pay. That they would do. They would join together for those things. But there does not seem to be any collective movement from the teachers to improve the standards or to make learning more teacher-centered, to get some of the bureaucracy out of the way. Why is there not more activism in the name of actual education from our teachers?
You're going to have this come from parents or high school students. We had high school students in the town that I was active in, Brookline, Massachusetts, at one point, who found out what the law was that applied to the rehiring of a teacher or the re-giving of a course. And those students did the work that in other communities would have to be done by parents. But if parents are going to be active on other issues, they're going to have to be active on the school curriculum. If they're not, I don't know who's going to want to teach their kids. There's going to be a different issue to face. Maybe they have to keep seeing that whatever they've done since the schools closed down last March, probably everywhere in this country, K through 12, or at the high school level certainly, where you would expect subject-oriented teaching. And at PTO meetings, they can expect more subject-oriented teaching to be explained to them. That is one start. Not being a PTA, but being a PTO, there is a huge difference. And I'm not sure everyone is aware of it. I found many of our state legislators, even the governor at one time, was not aware. The governor that went back several governors back, he didn't understand what the difference between the PTO and the PTA was. Well, if you have a PTO which supposedly concentrates only on the school that it belongs to, raises money or projects for the school, but can't involve itself in any politics, That's the kind of setting that will help to downplay what comes through a PTA, which often reflects union politics.
We're going to do another one of these next week. This will be the fourth and final one, and maybe we can sort of wrap some of these ideas up and make some final. This will be the first one done after the election results. So when we talk next Friday, well, I'm being optimistic. Maybe we'll know who the president is, but we'll have a sense who may have won the presidency. So maybe next time we'll be able to talk about that for the following weeks. I look forward to talking to you then.